Welcome to Varn Blog Solo. And I'm going to talk about the Kluge and why a whole lot of left wing reformist electoral efforts are doomed, just flat out doomed. That there is no way for them to work the way they are being aimed at and argued for. And once you accept that, you could start seeing what a more viable electoral strategy would be, etc. So, I was asked a question in my Discord group. The DSA a couple years back started arguing that DSA members needed to run for school boards because it was relatively easy to get on school boards. Often they are not high target election cycles. Usually people are barely opposed. Many of them are nonpartisan, depending on the state. And it would be a good way to oppose things like Moms for Liberty. Now, the Moms for Liberty school board strategy is interesting in that it is focused on cultural single issues, usually involving gender, that are more easy for activist parents to focus on and to do something about because they're excluded from general educational policy. Unlike creationist issues, they're not a matter of states' rights or legality in the same way. You're not having to deal with contestations about the First Amendment. And while it does overlap with federal policy, particularly Title IX issues, in general, it is in areas where federal policy is actually still unclear and has been decided largely by court decisions and case law, of which the case law is actually often in disagreement between different federal circuit courts. Now, one thing you need to understand about federal education law, with the exception of specific legislation, are things involving the Supreme Court, such as Brown versus Board of Education, or the Civil Rights Act, and also issues around the law's IDEA and its revision in 2001, I believe, and laws like NCLB. Most federal intervention in education actually can be supervened by just refusing to accept federal money. The federal money is also not a huge part of the school's budget and often has very limited usage. However, most schools run such a tight ship, and we'll get to misunderstandings there, that they have to take that money, particularly when it comes with additional supports for things like special needs students. Here's the catch, though. Usually the paperwork that the federal government requires and the surveys that the federal government requires actually requires the expansion of administration. It is a form of cost disease. And furthermore, to show action on these issues, it leads to a downstream discretionary consultancy where there's tons of kickbacks, etc. Also, the only way that you can make a lot of money on education, due to the fact that most of the cost goes directly into labor costs and thus can't be competitive, except by driving the cost of labor down, which you can only do so much and still attract the people that you want to educate. There are tons of ways in which education is used as a rent seeking for things like technology, building funding, etc. And the way that tax funds actually are adjudicated for this, because they often come from grant lines, are from referendum, temporary sales tax increases, etc., are separate from the way schools fund 92 to 93% of their costs, which are staffing, which comes usually from either property taxes plus like other kinds of things like gas taxes in some states, or property taxes plus a direct school tax. All right. Now, So stacking the school board, if you're a conservative, can be something to do those policies. And stacking the school board, if you're a leftist, to fight the conservatives, is something you can do, but it pretty much ends there. What school boards tend to do is approve policy orientations, etc., but they are downstream from state legislatures. They are downstream from federal circuit court rulings. They are downstream from dealing with the necessities of paperwork. They are downstream from state funding of schools. They are downstream from what lines of funding they can use, because they can't authorize the lines that's going to become from state and municipal government and legislation. So just throwing people in a school board, if you think it's going to refund teachers in a school or strengthen union negotiation positions or whatever, is not actually going to be able to achieve all of this, because there's, quote, multiple stakeholders and multiple rent seekings, which are not governed by the school board at all. So this strategy, while it can work well for the right, given the right's limited orientation, now they have bigger goals ultimately, but all they're really promising to do is to limit. And there's ironies in a lot of what they do. So, for example, there's a hatred of administration and conservative stuff. So there's a hatred of bureaucracy, one that I think is actually even justified. And yet, most of the moral legislation passed by conservatives expands bureaucracy, expands unaccountable state administrative power, expands the administrative state. It just makes it aimed at state level moral policing. You don't believe me? Look at what it requires to do the kinds of stuff DeSantis is doing in Florida, in a state that can barely fund its teachers. Florida, by the way, is one of the lower paying states, even in the South, although it's not as low as, like, say, Mississippi or Alabama, but it has a much higher cost of living. When I was abroad, there were 2 states that produce a lot of teachers abroad. So these are teachers desperate enough to leave the country. Now, they get good jobs abroad, and there's reasons for it, but usually people's first job, and they get into the international school teaching world after they've done a few years teaching in Florida. And since Florida doesn't have a good enough benefits package to keep them, many of them go abroad. Now, the other state is Arizona. And if you know anything about state laws, this would be no surprising to you. But the other problem is that where are the DSA people located? They're located in the areas that are already strong with progressive school boards, who already can't do what they want them to do, and often don't understand the implications of what they are doing. For example, equity and access is used to limit the ability to remove disrupted kids from the classroom, but since that's picked up by administrators as an excuse to do nothing, what that actually means too is it decreases everyone's access, and conservatives aren't wrong about that. Now, what are you going to do as a progressive school board member, even if you're in a nonpartisan affiliated school board, to counter that and to deal with the funding lines and to increase teacher pay, etc.? Because every increase of teacher pay you're going to do is probably going to have to come out of someone's property tax or direct school tax, whereas all the other funding is going to come from grants and other indirect taxations, or even largesse from the federal government. But to take that funding, you're going to have to expand administration. And to expand administration, you're going to have to attract the people to do that. That's led to the weird relationship that a lot of teachers have to this administrative drift, where they don't really want to oppose it because they see it as their only way out of an otherwise dead end position if they stay within the school system, which, by the way, 56% of them usually don't. Over half of teachers quit despite the high level of educational investment and free labor time, because remember, in almost every state, you have to do unpaid internship, of which you pay for your hours in the university, to be a teacher, to have a job that starts between $50,000 and $60,000 a year, but often only caps out after 20-25 years at only 10 to 15K more than that. And who's, even with fairly significant increases in base pay, still pays little enough over time that what we've seen is a steady decline in teachers entering teaching programs, etc. Now, some of that is also from social stigma, but it's not all social stigma. One of the things I've noticed is teaching has become a much more white profession, partly because it's now a do-gooder profession. It's a profession of people who come from stable enough backgrounds, either because they've married up or because they have a working spouse who's in a more professional background, or because they're just wealthy and can go do America, can go do, Teach for America, whatever, 15 years ago, and then get sucked into it because they have generational wealth in a trust fund than before. Whereas it's no longer really a means for, say, a middle class woman of color to get a stable position to support her family with decent hours and decent benefits. The benefits used to be good, but in almost all states outside of the Northeast, they've been pretty much precipitously declining. Now, you're going to fix that by appointing a few people to a school board, getting them elected to a school board. Good fucking luck. Because a lot of what's limiting you are things that have nothing to do with the immediate democratic local decisions. It has to do with the way state, local, and federal law interact. You would have to coordinate this at all levels for this to be a valid reform strategy, and you'd have to devote a whole lot of time to it. But most of the Democratic and Republican Party apparatus was actually devoted for the last 20 years off to rent seeking and things like charter schools. Now it's pretty much even abandoned that, and we've seen the growth of the homeschool movement, which is basically people saying, well, this is getting so bad that we just rather deal with it ourselves. And that used to be limited to religious people and other cultural modal types, but now it's everybody. Furthermore, there's little evidence that throwing money at the problem actually leads to success, either in the private or the public sector. And most of what actually increases administrative oversight doesn't lead to success either. In fact, there's good libertarian studies, and I hate to give libertarians credit, but they used to be very good on this. And I say used to be because they have realized that part of the cost disease problem is actually in their own rent-seeking apparatuses and public-private partnerships, which from a strict libertarian standpoint, they oppose, but they never end up actually opposing because clearly they benefit corporations in ways that give private individuals government money. And while in theory libertarians oppose that, they rarely do it in practice unless they're extremely principled. I mean, the irony of neoliberalism is actually overseeing an increase of the involvement of the state in your life, but not one in which you have institutions which can be made accountable to the public. No, instead it makes rent-seeking institutions accountable. This is why I have advocated a very much empower workers in their jobs and empower workers in their communities, and then coordinate this as much as possible. Because electoral reform tips that seem easy often don't even work for conservatives. See the creationist intelligent design wars of 20 years. And when they do work for conservatives, their gains are very limited. Mostly what happens are the domain of the property and business tax people who pay into the system in the first place. And unlike the federal government, since these agencies that pay for education do not have currency sovereignty, they cannot inflate their way out of it or deflate their way into it. In short, there is no real Keynesian or monetary mechanism for dealing with education without the federal government being involved, but the federal government constitutionally is limited in how it can be involved. And every time it does do something, because of the nature of its involvement constitutionally, usually being the regulation of funding, which is granted by the legislature to state education systems, which comes with additional oversights, etc., it expands the need for administration. Until you understand this, your electoral reform efforts will not just fail in the sense that they will probably not happen. But if they do happen, they'll be discrediting because you are promising things you are in no position to deliver. So when people are like, oh, we should use this to expand. No, if you're going to run for a school board to stop conservative shenanigans, all you should be doing is stopping conservative shenanigans and making sure that the people who actually run the thing can run it. Now, I want to say this. There is a comfortability with professionals that implies that I don't think we should have. I don't think we should have comfortability with administrative professionals and educational professionals, etc. Teachers are one thing, staff is one thing. Administration, whether we like it or not, in our system is necessary. So what are you going to do? Small alternative schools do not scale up. Many of them can help people, but they often become boutique things for the upper middle class anyway. So many whole schools, anarchist school systems, etc., Montessori, other things with useful paradigms and progressive or whatever you want to say. I don't like the term progressive. You guys know that, but socially responsible educational paradigms that are empowering the students in some cases. Are still, they become boutique. They get tied to upper middle class and upper class, often private education. And so the irony is these things that are used off and advocated for often for social justice actually have no relation to it whatsoever in practice and become indeed classed experiences or class social goods. Now, to get beyond the Kluge, you would have to coordinate this and radically rethink the constitutional relationship of states, municipalities, and the federal government in education. And then you have to think about it in relationship to the entire planet. Because these systems, and as long as we're in a capitalist systems, are creating specialists and workers, etc., that operate in competition with the specialists and workers of other nationalities. In other words, there is no simple fix that will fix this for you unless you look at the counter incentives in the system itself. And you can't do that just by taking over a school board. Now, if you take over school boards to prove that you could stop conservative things from going through and actually deliver on that, then maybe you can start to build other apparatuses to start changing the law. But you're going to have to get executives elected to appoint judges or to get judges to run from your position that have broad popular mandates in even very conservative areas. You're going to have to do this. Otherwise, you're basically creating a situation where you are going to fail and you're actually going to set yourself back in failure. And we already see that this is happening with the progressive and social democratic movement in the light of Biden's election. Now, I actually kind of predicted this. I talked about how the alt-right would decline with the election of Trump in the immediacy because it tied itself to something that it could not be implemented in our society just from the executive seat. And similarly, social democrats have saved the center at their own expense. And the people that they've elected will increasingly move away from them, and attempts to hold electeds accountable that view this solely from a partisan or institutional lens or from a left institutional lens are doomed to be ineffective in larger society. They are run by small organizations that are in large-ish organizations, but are still small and relative to a population of over 300 million. Get that through your skull. I've been saying it for since the DSA became on the scale, that it was amazing compared to the historical trajectory of the left. But when you adjust it for population sizes, we should be more skeptical because the SDS, the CPUSA, and the SPA were all significantly larger in real numbers and definitely in their effects in larger society. Now, until until Biden, ironically, during opposition to Trump, yes, the DSA actually hit above its weight, above what we would expect. It hit harder than its weight limit would indicate. But that is not true now. And it's also true that some of that hitting harder was actually being cynically used by centrists to get a young generation of people into the system where they have the money and time and talent to bring them up. Your reformist election schemes will not work unless you look at this holistically and stop trying to just piecemeal these things. Piecemealing these things has unforeseen consequences. Conservatives aren't wrong about that either. And you need to take that seriously. If you cannot, don't be involved. It is better to be apolitical than politicized poorly. Some things are worse than nothing at all. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. Please share this if it means something to you. Have a good day.